Welcome back to Miss Yusuf's English class. We're going to read chapter 62, 63, and 64. Chapter 62. I slept in fits that night. Shortly before sunrise, I gave up trying to fall asleep again and lifted myself on an elbow. I spied with my little eye a tiger. Richard Parker was restless. He was moaning and growling and pacing about the lifeboat. It was impressive. I assessed the situation. He couldn't be hungry, or at least not dangerously hungry. Was he thirsty? His tongue hung from his mouth, but only on occasion, and he was not panting, and his stomach and paws were still wet, but they were not dripping wet. There probably wasn't much water left in the lifeboat. Soon he would be thirsty. I looked up at the sky. The cloud cover had vanished, but for a few wisps on the horizon, the sky was clear. It would be another hot, rainless day. The sea moved in a lethargic way as if already exhausted by the oncoming heat. I sat against the mast and thought over our problem. The biscuits and the fishing gear assured us of the solid part of our diet. It was the liquid part that was the rub. It all came down to what was so abundant around us, but marred by salt. I could perhaps mix some seawater with his fresh water, but I had to procure more fresh water to start with. The cans would not last long between the two of us. In fact, I was loath to share even one with Richard Parker, and it would be foolish to rely on rainwater. The solar stills were the only other possible source of drinkable water. I looked at them doubtfully. They had been out 2 days now. I noticed that one of them had lost a little air. I pulled on the rope to tend to it. I topped off its cone with air. Without any real expectation, I reached underwater for the distillate pouch that was clipped to the round buoyancy chamber. My fingers took hold of a bag that was unexpectedly fat. A shiver of thrill went through me, but I controlled myself. As likely as not, salt water had leaked in. I unhooked the pouch and, following the instructions, lowered it and tilted the still so that any more water from beneath the cone might flow into it. I closed the two small taps that led to the pouch, detached it, and pulled it out of the water. It was rectangular in shape and made of thick, soft yellow plastic with calibration marks on one side. I tasted the water. I tasted it again. It was salt-free. "My sweet cow!" I exclaimed to the solar still. "You've produced!" "And how? What a delicious milk! Mind you, a little rubbery, but I'm not complaining. Why, look at me drink!" I finished the bag. It had a capacity of 1 liter and was nearly full. After a moment of sigh-producing, shut-eyed satisfaction, I reattached the pouch. I checked the other stills. Each one had an udder similarly heavy. I collected the fresh milk, over 8 liters of it, in the fish bucket. Instantly, these technological contraptions became as precious to me as cattle are to a farmer. Indeed, as they floated placidly in the ark, they looked almost like cows grazing in a field. I ministered to their needs, making sure that there was enough seawater inside each and that the cones and the chambers were inflated to just the right pressure. After adding a little seawater to the bucket's contents, I placed it on the side bench beyond the top. With the end of the morning coolness, Richard Parker seemed safely settled below. I tied the bucket in place using the rope and the tarpaulin hooks on the side of the boat. I carefully peeked over the gunwale. He was lying on his side. His den was a foul sight. The dead mammals were heaped together, a grotesque pile of decayed animal parts. I recognized a leg or two, various patches of hide, parts of a head, and a great number of bones. Flying fish wings were scattered about. I cut up a flying fish and tossed a piece of it onto the side bench. After I had gathered what I needed for the day from the locker and I was ready to go, I tossed another piece over the tarpaulin in front of Richard Parker. It had the intended effect. As I drifted away, I saw him come out into the open to fetch the morsel of fish. His head turned and he noticed the other morsel and the new object next to it. He lifted himself. He hung his huge head over the bucket. I was afraid he would tip it over, but he didn't. His face disappeared into it, barely fitting, and he started to lap up the water. In very little time, the bucket started shaking and rattling emptily with each strike of his tongue. When he looked up, I stared him aggressively in the eyes and blew on the whistle a few times. He disappeared under the tarpaulin. It occurred to me that with every passing day, the lifeboat was resembling a zoo enclosure more and more. Richard Parker had his sheltered area for sleeping and resting, his food stash, his lookout, and now his water hole. The temperature climbed. The sea became stifling. I spent the rest of the day in the shade of the canopy fishing. It seemed I had had beginner's luck with that first Dorado. I caught nothing the whole day, not even in the late afternoon when marine life appeared in abundance. A turtle turned up, a different kind this time, a green sea turtle, bulkier and smoother shelled, but curious in the same fixed way as a hawksbill. I did nothing about it, but I started thinking that I should. The only good thing about the day being so hot was the sight the solar stills presented. Every cone was covered on the inside with drops and rivulets of condensation. The day ended. I calculated that the next morning would make it a week since the Simpson had sunk. Chapter 63. The Robertson family survived 38 days at sea. Captain Bligh, at the celebrated Mucinous Bounty, and his fellow castaways survived 47 days. Stephen Callahan survived 76. Owen Chase, whose account of the sinking of the whaling ship Essex by a whale inspired Herman Melville, survived 83 days at sea with 2 mates, interrupted by a 1-week stay on an inhospitable island. The Bailey family survived 118 days. I have heard of a Korean merchant sailor named Poon, I believe, who survived the Pacific for 173 days in the 1950s. I survived 227 days. That is how long my trial lasted. Over 7 months. I kept myself busy. That was the one key to my survival. On a lifeboat, even on a raft, there's always something that needs doing. An average day for me, if such a notion can be applied to a castaway, went like this. Sunrise to mid-morning. Wake up. Prayers. Breakfast for Richard Parker. General inspection of raft and lifeboat with particular attention paid to all knots and ropes. Tending of the solar stills. Wiping, inflating, topping off with water. Breakfast and inspection of food stores. Fishing and preparing fish, if any caught, gutting, cleaning, hanging of strips of flesh on lines to cure in the sun. Mid-morning to late afternoon. Prayers, light lunch, rest and restful activities, writing in diary, examining of scabs and sores, upkeeping of equipment, puttering about locker, observation and study of Richard Parker, picking at of turtle bones, etc. Late afternoon to evening. Prayers, fishing and preparing of fish, tending of curing strips of flesh, turning over, cutting away of putrid parts. Dinner preparations, dinner for self and Richard Parker. Sunset, general inspection of raft and lifeboat, knots and ropes again, collecting and safekeeping of distillate from solar stills, storing of all foods and equipment arrangements for the night, making of beds, safe storage of the raft of flare in case of a ship, and the rain catcher in case of rain. Prayers. Night. Fitful sleeping, prayers. Mornings were usually better than late afternoons when the emptiness of time tended to make itself felt. Any number of events affected this routine. Rainfall at any time of the day or night stopped all other business. For as long as it fell, I held up the rain catchers and was feverishly occupied storing their catch. A turtle's visit was another major disruption, and Richard Parker, of course, was a regular disturbance. Accommodating him was a priority I could not neglect, not for a second. He didn't have much of a routine beyond eating, drinking, and sleeping, but there were times when he stirred from his lethargy and rambled about his territory, making noises and being cranky. Thankfully, every time the sun and the sea quickly tired him, and he returned to beneath the tarpaulin to the lying of his light on his side again, or flat on his stomach, his head on top of his crossed front legs. But there was more to my dealings with him than strict necessity. I also spent hours observing him because it was a distraction. A tiger is a fascinating animal at any time, and all the more so when it is your sole companion. At first, looking out for the ship was something I did all the time, compulsively, but after a few weeks, 5 or 6, I stopped doing it entirely. And I survived because I made a point of forgetting. My story started on a calendar day, July 2nd, 1977, and ended on a calendar day, February 14th, 1978. But in between, there was no calendar. I did not count the days or the weeks or the months. Time is an illusion that only makes us pant. I survived because I forgot even the very notion of time. What I remember are events and encounters and routine markers that emerged here and there from the ocean of time and imprinted themselves on my memory. The smell of spent hand flare shells and prayers at dawn and the killing of turtles and the biology of algae, for example, and many more. But I don't know if I can put them in any order for you. My memories come in a jumble. Chapter 64. My clothes disintegrated, victims of the sun and salt. First they became gauze thin, then they tore until only the seams were left. Lastly, the seams broke. For months I lived stark naked except for the whistle that dangled from my neck by a string. Saltwater boils, red, angry, disfiguring, were a leprosy of the high seas, transmitted by the water that soaked me. Where they burst, my skin was exceptionally sensitive. Accidentally rubbing an open sore was so painful I would gasp and cry out. Naturally, these boils developed on the parts of my body that got the most wet and the most wear on the raft, that is, my backside. There were days when I could hardly find a position in which I could rest. Time and sunshine healed a sore, but the process was slow, and new boils appeared if I didn't stay dry. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 62, 63, and 64. Stay tuned for chapter 65.